Hey everyone, this is Pete, and today I'd like to talk about Super Woden GP 2, an isometric perspective racing game for PC developed by Vihuda. Apologies if I'm butchering that, this is one of those situations where I have to sort of take a best guess. A solo developer from Vigo, Spain, who occasionally moonlights as a musician known as DJ DeVito. It is, as the name suggests, the sequel to Super Woden GP, which released on PC in 2021 and was subsequently ported to consoles by East Asia Soft in 2022, so hopefully we'll see a console port of this eventually also. Before we go any further, let's get one important thing out of the way, the title. Why Super Woden GP? There's actually not a particularly elaborate reason behind it. The developer apparently once had a band named Woden, and he wanted to pay tribute to it. And the band didn't have a particularly deep reason for choosing the name either. In the dev's own words, they googled some random stuff and liked it. Woden, if you're curious, is the name of a god. Some simply see it as an alternative earlier spelling of Odin from Norse mythology, but Woden specifically appears to have his own distinct background. Without getting too far into matters that are well beyond the scope of this video, Woden was one of the key gods in the pantheon of pagan Anglo-Saxon culture, and the word Wednesday is derived from his name. Some equate Woden directly with the Roman deity Mercury, but it is in fact more likely that the Romans simply did what they often did, matched up members of different pantheons according to those who had similar characteristics. Both Woden and Mercury are connected with language and poetry, for example, so the Romans effectively consider them to be the same. Indeed, in modern Romance languages, the word for Wednesday is derived from Mercury rather than Woden. Mercredi in French, if you'll pardon the pronunciation, is probably the most well-known example. Anyway, none of this has anything to do with Super Woden GP2. The dev just chose it because it reminded him of something from his past and it sounded cool, and that's that. So there you go. Super Woden GP2's existence in 2023 is interesting, because it ties in with how various different game genres have evolved and changed over the years. Arguably few genres have gone through more drastic changes over the years than racing games, as they've tended to be on the cutting edge of technology throughout gaming history. In the earliest days of racing games, we had top-down titles such as Atari's Sprint and Grand Track games, but there were also early experiments with 3D effects such as Sega's Turbo and Namco's Pole Position. The latter weren't true 3D games, as the technology of the time wasn't yet up to the task. Rather, they simulated 3D through the use of parallel lines that disappeared into the screen and converged at the vanishing point. Alongside this, which was used to create the outline of the road, additional effects such as scaling sprites were added to improve the illusion of a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional display. Top-down races didn't go away immediately though. Titles like Super Sprint and Super Off-Road enjoyed success in the arcades, but they too added some quasi-3D effects such as jumps, bumps and bridges into the mix to make the action a bit more convincing. Games like Gremlin's Supercars series on home computers showed there was still plenty of life in this style of racer, particularly if he added weapons into the mix. Eventually, pure top-down gave way to an isometric perspective, allowing for more complex courses to be presented with a more convincing quasi-3D effect. Titles like Super RC Pro-Am, Super Skidmarks and World Rally all showed how this style of presentation could make for interesting gameplay and thrilling high-speed action, with an almost TV-style presentation if the underlying tech and hardware was up to the task of throwing detailed visuals around. Then the polygons came. Games like Atari's Hard Driving and Namco's Winning Run kicked off a revolution in arcade racing games, and home computer and console developers started experimenting with a similar means of presentation. Now, the advent of true 3D graphics, or as close as you were going to get on a flat display anyway, meant that players could really put themselves in the cockpit. There was no turning back from there. Sega's Virtua Racing and Namco's Ridge Racer established the polygonal racer in the arcades, and a few years later, Sony's Gran Turismo showed that the realistic racing car sim was finally within reach of modern gaming hardware. The latter was particularly important because gradually, over time, the sim-like approach to racing games started to creep towards being the default, as opposed to the immediately accessible simple arcade racing of earlier years. And today, it's rare to find a new racing game that doesn't err significantly on the side of sim, even in the case of more casual-friendly titles such as the Forza Horizon series. Sim racers definitely have their appeal, particularly if you have a decent steering wheel controller to enjoy them with. But I must confess that over time the racing game genre has been becoming a bit boring, a bit safe. At the time of recording, it's not long since the 8th mainline entry in the Gran Turismo-like Forza Motorsport series is released, and it's hard to care at this point. Sure, it looks nice, but it's still basically the same game as the previous 7. And being a AAA game from 2023, it's expensive, rammed with DLC and microtransactions, and frequently insulting to your intelligence. But you can go and watch my good friend Dudley's video on the subject if you want to know more about that. I'll also note that I tried Forza Horizon 4 a while back, and while it was enjoyable enough, I quickly tired of it due to the fact that you can progress through it even if you lose every single race you enter. It didn't take long for the whole thing to start feeling meaningless, as pretty as the visuals were. My point is, photorealistic 3D is all well and good, but for a while it's felt like racing games confining themselves to this perspective and aesthetic was limiting their creativity somewhat, which is why games like Super Woden GP 2 are such a breath of fresh air. Super Woden GP 2 acknowledges that the overall structure of modern racing sims such as Gran Turismo and Forza Motorsport is inherently satisfying. Buy car, race car, upgrade car, win money, race more car, buy more car, upgrade more car, race more car, win more money, repeat. This gameplay loop has stayed the same for so long because it works. Super Woden GP2's main distinguishing feature is that rather than marrying that structure to a challenging sim-like approach that unfolds from a realistic three-dimensional perspective, it instead adopts an isometric view somewhat akin to looking down on a slot car track, and features highly enjoyable, exaggerated arcade-style handling. That means lots of drifting, very close races, and the opportunity to play in a pretty full contact sort of way without penalty. Just my sort of thing. It's such a simple idea, but it really works. At least partly thanks to the well-crafted difficulty curve. You can jump in and start enjoying Super Woden GP2 right from the beginning without feeling underpowered and outclassed by your opponents. The early races are very forgiving and straightforward, and it's easy to scrape enough money together for some upgrades and additional cars. Plus you get free cars for finishing the various events in the game too. As you progress, things start to get more and more difficult. Not necessarily just through challenging you to keep more powerful rides under control, but pitting you against more aggressive AI, tasking you with traversing trickier courses, and presenting you with the unique difficulties that longer races pose. And it's thoroughly compelling. There are several distinct components to Super Woden GP2. A self-contained arcade mode focuses on the game's rally stages, and challenges you to progress through a series of courses with preset cars and a limited number of retry attempts. This is a good means of familiarising yourself with the game, plus it distinguishes itself from the main event by rendering the whole thing with an exaggerated CRT style filter on the visuals. Honestly, there's enough fun and challenge to be had in the arcade mode to make Super Woden GP2 worth 10 quid, but it doesn't stop there, not by a long shot. On the Gran Turismo style main game map, you have the opportunity to visit various car dealers and purchase new rides for yourself. Some cars are not available to be purchased but are still visible, giving you a hint of the vehicles you might be able to score for completing the more challenging championships. You can also upgrade your car from the workshop screen on the game map. This is a simple process where you can improve the engine, gearbox, tyre, chassis strength, brakes and suspension of your vehicle, though some cars can be upgraded more than others. You also have to be a little careful with engine upgrades in particular. Most events in Super Woden GP2 have a maximum horsepower value, so you'll need to ensure that the car you intend to use doesn't exceed this through excessive upgrading. Cars also suffer wear and tear over time. Cleanliness is purely cosmetic, but it can be fixed with a trip to the car wash. The more you use a car though, the more its oil will suffer, so every so often you'll need to replace it. This means you'll need to budget for maintenance costs as well as purchasing new vehicles, though in the early game this isn't much of an issue. The upgrade and maintenance system works well, but there's not a ton of depth to it. Generally speaking, you're best off just upgrading each car you get, or at least intend to use frequently, as much as possible, so long as it doesn't go over a horsepower threshold, and then that car is pretty much ready for whatever you'd care to throw at it. As someone who has no idea what all the in-depth settings in games like Gran Turismo and Forza Motorsport do, I'm glad to not have to worry about gear ratios, brake balance and such like, but it would perhaps have been nice to have elements such as different tyres for different types of course or weather condition. Once you've got a car and it's in good working order, you can either run a time trial on any of the game's courses to test it out, or pit yourself against the global leaderboards, or head to the Go Race section for the main bulk of the game. Within Go Race, There are a few different areas. Weekend events are one-shot single races, while a series of championships unfold across multiple rounds. Endurance events are long races in which you'll need to ensure your car doesn't suffer too much damage. And rally events are fairly self-explanatory, though you are obliged to use cars specifically marked as rally types for these events. No hooning through the Kenyan wilderness in a 1969 Mini Cooper for you, more's the pity. The weekend, championship and endurance events all have their own requirements too. Some might be themed around a particular car or type of car. Some might be specifically limited to low power vehicles or focus on high performance sports cars. Some restrict you to a single maker or model of car. But there are also plenty where you have the freedom and flexibility to race how you please. Which is good, because Super Woden GP2 has a lot of cars, including some truly iconic vehicles such as the DeLorean from Back to the Future, albeit without its real branding. It's a lot of fun to replay events with different vehicles and see how you do, and with Super Woden GP2's reasonably generous payouts for finish positions other than first, it's not a waste of time to do so either. Progression through the game comes via earning stars, which are accumulated by winning events. In the case of weekend races, you get a star for finishing the race in first place. Championships, as you might expect, require you to place first overall over a series of races. The more stars you have, the more events are open to you, though there's nothing to stop you replaying favourite events to earn more money. You just don't get any more stars for doing so. Completing an entire category of events typically also rewards you with a bonus car. For example, in a weekend event that consists of 2 single races, placing first in both will reward you with a new ride. Often, these vehicles are ideal for use in another event. It's just a case of figuring out which one. And to help you with this, most events in Super Woden GP2 provide a convenient list of suggested vehicles for you to use. If you're having trouble, try using one of these. If you're still having trouble, try upgrading it. And if you're still having trouble, either get good, or perhaps try a new car from the list of suggestions. The one you've got simply might not be working for you, because various different vehicles do handle noticeably differently from one another. In the race itself, things are kept straightforward and simple. There's no gear changing to worry about, so it's just about putting your foot to the floor and occasionally letting up or braking when it comes to a particularly tight corner. Handling is pretty drift heavy in most vehicles, so may take some time to get accustomed to, but that's why the earliest races are so forgiving. This is a lesson learned from the original Super Woden GP, which was bastard hard right from the outset, and consequently nowhere near as approachable and accessible as its follow-up. In regular lap-based track races, you're given a generic on-screen warning as a corner approaches, and you're expected to have either memorised the track or checked the minimap in the corner of the screen to know what's coming. The point-to-point rally races, meanwhile, are more specific with their directions, featuring an enthusiastic European woman informing you the direction and severity of upcoming turns, sounding as if she has a broad grin on her face throughout. By far the best thing about Super Woden GP2 is just how good it feels to drive. It's hard to convey quite how good it feels without putting a controller in your hand and just letting you play, but it really is a delight. It's a distinct experience from the assist-heavy, snappy handling of something like Galco's World Rally, and it doesn't cross the line into oversensitivity in the way titles like Super Sprint do at times. It just feels right, and it's a genuine pleasure to play. And I'm pretty sure a big part of that comes down to the perspective. Sure, it's thrilling and exciting to slam a car sideways in first person, but looking down on the action from above, there's a graceful elegance to it all that is quite unlike any other racing game I've played in recent memory. Plus, from a purely functional perspective, it's a lot easier to see whether you're taking an optimal line through corners, or to have situational awareness while in the middle of the pack. The other thing that I find is particularly praiseworthy is how Super Woden GP2 is absolutely packed with things to do, yet at no point does it feel overwhelming. It's not a game you'll beat quickly, and your definition of beat may vary from clear all the events once to collect every car in the game, depending on your personality type, but doing so feels well within reach of even more casual players. It's simply a well-crafted game that has been optimised well to provide a satisfying experience without a lot of the fluff that comes along with bigger budget titles these days. I can't stop thinking about what a pleasure it is to play from a perspective other than first person or over-the-shoulder third person though. It makes me wonder how many other types of game could really benefit from deliberately eschewing the most cutting-edge means of presenting their action, and instead looking to games from the past for inspiration. I bet there's a fair few. And as always, it's going to be the indie developers working on passion projects who explore that concept, rather than the big name studios with limitless budgets. It makes games like this a prime example of what I talked about in my video about modern gaming not being as bad as some commentators might like to make out. Sure, there may be a lot to criticise in, say, the latest Forza titles due to them playing things obnoxiously safe, but the big budget, big name games are not our only option these days. Titles like Super Woden GP 2 show us that there's still room for creativity and passion, even in genres that have been pretty much solved today, like racing games. I know at this point I'd rather spend my time with Super Woden GP 2, which strikes a good balance between challenging me and respecting my time, than Forza Horizon 4, which just felt like participation trophy the game. Your mileage may vary, if you'll pardon the thematically appropriate cliche, but that's the beauty of gaming in 2023. You have choice. You can even enjoy multiple different takes on the same genre with no adverse effects. Who'd have thought it? And on that note, the racetrack is calling me once again. So I'll just say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.